I'm Dr. Holly Richmond. I have a PhD in somatic psychology. So for anybody who doesn't know, soma translates to the body. So I'm a body-based psychotherapist. However, I don't do touch, but we talk, everything is mediated through the body and the nervous system. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in California, Oregon, and New Jersey, and I'm a certified sex therapist.
Incredible. Wow. Okay. So you have a PhD in somatic therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me more about that. How do you use the body for therapy?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the beginning just a little bit, just to tell you how I put this together. In the state of California, you have to do 3,000 hours of internship, and I chose to do mine at the Santa Barbara Rape Crisis Center. And I quickly learned that I was taught very well how to treat trauma, but I didn't know how to treat the what comes next. And to me, the what comes next is healthier relationships and a really great sex life. That seemed like a gap in the research. So I decided to do my dissertation on the recovery of sexual health after sexual trauma. From that place of really getting my hands, and I'm a trauma therapist at heart, but I figured out I couldn't talk about trauma unless I was talking about the body, and I couldn't talk about the body unless I was talking about sexuality. So that's kind of where the marriage and family therapist led to the PhD in somatic psychology, led to the certification in talk therapy. And to me, those three just all go together, like this. I can't talk about one without the other.
Let's say someone has trauma and they talk it out, but you're right. We also have nervous systems, we have body memory. So it does make sense that if you're not addressing the body, then it's not necessarily the whole picture.
That's exactly right. So sexual trauma happens in the body, and therefore I believe it has to be healed through the body. So even though in my work I'm doing talk-based therapy, it's very heavy on nervous system regulation, grounding, down-regulating, up-regulating. Personal disclosure here, the reason somatic psychology was so interesting to me, and I didn't know it really from the jump, of course it was about working with survivors, but I realized in studying this that I'm a somaticizer, meaning my body will often tell me something is wrong before my head catches up. Like I just lead with my body. I move through the world with my body. So there could be chronic pain. There could be just constant like jitteriness or outright shaking or a level of lethargy. So again, for a lot of us, and especially survivors, we meet the world through our body. And the easiest way, and this is very reductive and simplistic, but I just use a scale from 1 to 10. 1 is almost catatonic, severely depressed. 10 is full on panic attack. So once we figure out, or I figure out where my client is on that nervous system scale, am I upregulating or am I downregulating? And then we build somatic practices around that.
Fascinating.
So yeah. Yeah, with psychotherapy thrown in there too. But yeah, but where are we going? Because people always talk about regulating the nervous system. Where are we and which way do we need to go?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's an important distinction to throw in there because from what I see, a lot of the like quick tips online on how to regulate your nervous system is actually down regulating, but maybe that's not what everyone needs.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
That is really interesting that you are really using so many different avenues to help your patients and to treat them. I know you mentioned at the start of our call that you also use sex tech and AI. I'd love to learn more about how you use sex tech with your patients.
Yeah, so back in 2015, 2016, VR was really coming onto the scene. And I remember watching a TV show about it, nothing to do with sexuality at all. And it was just like a light bulb went off. And I got really interested. I was like, VR is going to change the way we do therapy. And again, I don't know, it takes me a long time to catch up to myself sometimes. I'm like, why the hell am I so excited about this? Because I'm not a technophile at all. And after, so I was a journalist for 15 years before I did therapy before I went back to school to therapy. So I just started digging and talking to like the top players in the VR sex tech space. And then the penny dropped, and I was like, oh, because sex tech is somatic therapy. It's a body-based experience of mediating our world. So if you're using VR porn, right? You're not just watching porn, you're experiencing porn. And even in traditional psychotherapy, so we use it for exposure therapy. So it's not, again, people reading or talking or watching. They're feeling being on the plane. They're feeling being up high on a mountain to work with fears or phobias. And in the same way, I was like, can we use VR and immersive sex tech to help people with relationships and sex? So my first thought was like, how can we use this for survivors? And I worked on a VR program there. And then it got more relational. And I had the chance to work with Harmony, the AI sex doll from, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on their name right now, from Real Dolls. They're based in Las Vegas. They were based in the San Diego area for a while. So Matt McMullen is the president, the founder of Real Dolls. So he and I hooked up with a production company out of London, and we worked with Harmony, the AI sex doll, and a client who was an adult virgin, and just worked with her and him to help him be comfortable relationally, and then as a bridge. So Harmony was a bridge for him from never having experienced any kind of date or sexuality with a woman to being able to go on dates and take his life in the direction that he had hoped for.
That is so fascinating to me. And if you're able to share, what were the results of that experience?
So he was so comfortable with her. I was kind of giving Matt cues to give Harmony in a relational context. It worked great for him. And when we did a follow-up a few months later, he was going on dates and feeling more comfortable just because he had language for how to relate to a woman. I mean, he had never even held a woman's hand. So we were really starting at ground level. Again, I'm not saying everyone needs an AI sex doll. It's not going to be for a lot of people. And it was a great solution for him, but it's a bridge. Just like most sex tech to me is a bridge, except for our digisexuals who really feel like the only way they want to engage with their sexuality is through technology. And I think with live Jasmin and camming, we're right in that space as well. And to me, it's just super important that we don't pathologize that.
Wow, that is so incredibly said. Thank you for that. It's really interesting because as you were describing your patient, it reminded me of a member I've interviewed where he told me that prior to having experiences on Live Jasmin, he would never approach a woman. A woman had to approach him if it were a social setting. He was too shy and too uncomfortable. He had too much fear around it. But he said because of these interactions he had with these like beautiful women, and they were positive interactions, that ended up translating into confidence, that now when he's out with his friends, he feels confident and more willing to approach a woman and ask her out or ask for her number or whatever the case is. And so how Harmony was used in that situation, like you said, it almost might be some form of exposure therapy, because when you've absolutely never done something before, there's always, at the very least, a nervousness around doing it if it's never been done and this is the real deal. But for some people, as you know best, it's a real fear and a phobia.
It is. It's paralyzing anxiety. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then you also mentioned people who are digisexual. Is that what you call, where they prefer their sexual encounters to be online or through some type of technology? I haven't interviewed anyone as of yet that is permanently that way, but I can tell you I've interviewed a few members who have recently gone through a really bad divorce. And so they were not interested in a real life relationship and what they perceive as the potential drama that can come from that. They still wanted intimacy and connection, but they wanted it to be transactional so that it was within a certain confine of how it would go, no drama.
Right, right. And it's so contained and clear and expected. We know everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. It's wonderful. I love hearing that. And I think so my big you heard me say I don't want digisexuals pathologized. So I feel like really um my care here, my hope here is that we come to this with a sex positive perspective. And for me, that's this. All sex is good sex as long as it's consensual and pleasurable. Literally, we have to check two boxes. Is this consensual? Is this pleasurable? There's no, is this weird? Is this wrong? Oh my gosh, no one does that. None of it. And I would never use a word like perverted or anything like that, because if it checks consent and pleasure, which as you and I know, most online interactions in this way, in the camming world, they check both those boxes, but we just live in a world that hasn't quite caught up to us yet. But it's so damaging for our adult virgins or for a person who is just not ready to date for whatever reason it is. If we can keep our judgment out of it, everyone would be happier.
I feel like that is such a powerful statement. And it's actually one of the first times I've heard it be so clear. Is it pleasurable? Is it consensual? It is. Then it's good.
We're done.
Yeah. That is so clear. I mean, I don't know how you can get more basic and clear than those two things.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on why we are so concerned about what is happening behind closed doors, even if it is consensual and pleasurable? Very weird dynamic that I find here, especially in the States, where it's like we're obsessed with sex, we use it to sell everything. But if you want to get really real and talk about it and have real conversations about sex or intimacy, we're very uncomfortable.
I mean, this is such an important question. And I know you've had on Wednesday Martin, who is a social anthropologist. So she's she's going to answer this beautifully. My perspective is we just have to remember where the US came from, which is Puritans. So we still like those puritanical streams of consciousness that just infiltrate so many parts of our lives still. And I want to say the patriarchy, and this is not anti-men, but the patriarchy is anti-women being sexually empowered. So when we're talking about sex tech, which women are usually on the purveying end, right? They're usually the cammer, the person selling services in some way. If she's empowered, that is a threat to the system.
The way you've put things into words is incredible. It's just very poignant and powerful, because I think that is a really important distinction, that this is not about being anti-men. This is about women being empowered. And that's an important distinction to make, I think, for everyone, men and women included in that, that we don't need to tear men down. And that's not like the real goal or objective here. The goal and objective is for women to be empowered too in many ways. And yeah, sexuality is part of that.
Right. Right. And it's just, I have so many friends in sex tech who have started companies, who have created products. Our society makes it really hard for them to get bank accounts. It makes it really hard for them to stay online without, aspects. And we've all heard about the different media feeds that have been shut down because they're improper or whatever the current bullshit is. But so many times that's taking women out of financial security and that sense of empowerment.
This is something that models face a lot. I've heard stories of, some of our models, we call them our Jasmin millionaires, because they are millionaires now from few years of camming. And I've heard stories of models that have applied to get a house. And if they have to share what they do for work, there's judgment around that. It makes it difficult for them to get certain things that they need, simply because of the industry they work in, even if they have millions of dollars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was beautifully said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned the VR goggles, and how this can really help with exposure therapy. You mentioned the sex doll that literally is giving someone, again, that exposure therapy, giving them a chance to kind of experience things. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on sexual surrogacy?
Yeah. I wish this was legal too. And it's a gray area, but I've heard some scary stories from therapists like myself. So for your listeners who may not know, we're working with the sexual surrogate. So there's the sex therapist, there's the patient, and then there's the surrogate partner therapist. And we work in a triad, we work in a triangle, and everyone's talking to everyone. So my part, I'm doing the talk therapy. The sexual surrogate's part, she or he is doing the hands-on teaching, coaching this patient to have the kind of sex that they deserve to have. I wish more people were doing it. I can't even tell you how many patients I've had that would benefit so much from a surrogate partner therapist, and there are so few in the States. First, because it's not truly legal. Second, it's a job that not everybody could do, right? Like and you have to that's a training. This is not just someone that says, oh, sure, I'll have sex with you. This is thousands of hours of training that they go through to help people have the kind of sex they want to have. I wish there was more of it. So I think that's my bottom line.
When I do these interviews with therapists, a lot of them have said that they could see the potential of using a campsite as a type of sexual surrogacy. Obviously, it's not in person, but
Right.
you can get a certain feel for certain things, you know? And I'm curious because we did have a program a year or two ago where we were getting some, I mean, we still do, we get a lot of military personnel on the site. And so we actually had specific models that were trained in how to deal with them a lot of times because they have PTSD.
Right.
And so these particular military personnel were with models that were trained to really handle them in a little bit of a different way. Really, from the models I interviewed that were part of this program, they just wanted to talk, which is so interesting. Like they just wanted
Yeah.
to be listened to. That's it. Like heard, you know?
Yeah.
Um, please.
Yeah. I think we need more of that. So with one of the VR companies back in 2017, I worked on a program for them called Virtual Sexology. So it was like VR therapy, but very pleasure based. But I'm just wondering, VR or even not VR, but just through camming, let's say you even have a woman, a 30-year-old woman who comes to the site because she's never had an orgasm and she feels broken and she feels different and she's afraid to date because she thinks, oh my gosh, my partner is never going to accept me if they know I don't know how to have an orgasm. So we pair her with one of the live Jasmin models who can show her on herself how to self-pleasure.
Yeah.
Or the same thing for a man that comes in that's never had a sexual encounter and he says, I have no idea how to touch a woman. How do I touch breasts? How do I touch a butt? What does anal sex look like? How would you even do that? Just having a model that could walk him through that would be incredibly just informative, empowering, all of the things. It would take that fear factor out, I think.
Absolutely. I've thought about this so much now that it's come up so much about having some type of little pilot program or something, you know, choosing a few models that can really work with and talk to a therapist, and then sending that patient to the model and seeing
Do
what
it.
happens. No, really. No, really.
It would be so helpful. And it's like that education meets entertainment. And I think, for some people, it's mostly about pleasure, but for others, they're coming in so fresh and just need the sex education behind it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what it sounds like. So interesting.
Mhm.
Really. I'd like that also you pointed out that sex tech is essentially a lot of it, the somatic part of healing, because you're right, your body is getting reactive to whatever you're experiencing.
Right, right. And it's different. Like I feel like camming is a level up from porn because again, porn we're just watching and camming there's some kind of interaction, even through a screen. And I do almost all of my therapy online now, but you get a resonance, right? You can feel where someone's nervous system is. You feel pretty damn calm to me today. But just that feeling of interacting with each other, having to communicate, and for some digisexuals, they're only going to be comfortable chatting online. So they're not going to want to use their voice. They're just going to want to type. We just meet everyone where they are. And if we can do that without stigma and without judgment, the world's a better place.
I love that. I love that so much. And actually, I just have all these light bulbs going off, but I think now that I think about it, that might be why sex tech and AI is increasingly becoming used by therapists and psychologists, because whether they know it or not, they're getting that somatic experience for their patients, which is the other part of the puzzle, it sounds like, for their healing. Like talk therapy might not be enough, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many of us are working online now. I mean, being in person with people, talk about somatic, we can do a lot, but there's a lot you can do online. I love the online because it gives someone who's based, I'm on the East Coast, someone can be near you on the West Coast, and I still have the opportunity to work with them. So they could be like, okay, Dr. Holly does the recovery of sexual health after sexual trauma. Yes, that's me. Or Dr. Holly does sex tech. I need help with that. So we can really find the specialist that we want to work with and make sure the fit is right, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I live in this little small town, I've only got 2 therapists to choose from, and neither of them deal with sexuality. Yeah, you're not going to want to go to a sex negative therapist if you want to learn how to date, if you need sex education. And I want to dial that back a little bit. The therapist might not be sex negative, but they might not have any training in human sexuality.
Absolutely. I mean,
Right.
I interviewed Patty Britton, who started Sex
Yes.
Coach You, and she said she started it because she saw the need of so many OBGYNs, therapists, psychologists who had no idea how to talk about sex with people. They were uncomfortable themselves. They didn't know how to answer the questions. And so she saw the need in the professional space. So clearly there's a need.
There is. And Dr. Patty was one of my mentors. Yeah, she's so
Was
wonderful.
she?
Yeah, yeah. So I met her in 2000, probably 8. Yeah, 8 or 9. One of her workshops was my first when I started getting my sex therapy certification. She's amazing.
Incredible.
Yeah.
It turns out I didn't even realize it, but after I interviewed her, I started asking people where they got their sex coach certification out of curiosity, and almost everyone has gotten it from her or they know her.
It's honestly a pretty small community of sex therapists, sex educators, counselors, researchers. I mean, we're everywhere, but I wish there were more of us.
And why do you think it is still so small?
I think we're finally catching up. I feel like younger people today have more sex education, mostly because they have access to the internet and they can be online and they can ask. And I do believe that we're moving in a sex positive direction in some areas. There's still so far to go, obviously, because of all the litigation and censorship and hate and things like that going on in some states. But I honestly believe for a 20-something these days, she or he or they are going to have more exposure to good, correct sex education information because they can go online instead of having to try to figure it out for themselves.
And that's definitely part of our goal with this series, is
Ah,
kind of get the conversation started and moving forward. But again, in a responsible way, because we don't want to just pull from, well, Cosmopolitan said that this is the latest. We want to speak to people who, like you, who are in the field, who have experience. You have traditional schooling and background, but you've also taken additional certifications and courses, and you're using them with your patients. That's really important. I want to go back to something that we kind of lightly touched on, which is that there's this degree of resonance that is able to happen online. And I want to ask you, why is resonance important? What are patients getting from that?
So nervous system, usually de-escalation. So it's about eye contact. There's so much that's about eye contact, and prosody is another somatic quality that I talk about. So just tone of voice, pacing of voice, um, facial expressions. It's so important to be seen. And that's why when I got your email about camming and live Jasmin, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, because I send my patients to you guys all the time if that's what they're looking for. And you should talk to someone about this at some point. There are a lot of partners out there that feel like camming is cheating. So I feel like that's a whole conversation. Maybe you've already had it. There's a whole conversation relationally between patients themselves about camming. I just feel like you're sitting on a gold mine of if the performer, if the model is trained, even if she's not though, but if she can just help a member feel attractive, chosen, desirable, intelligent, whatever they're looking for, I feel like a good model would be able to do that. And in the same way, a therapist is going to, again, be able to meet our patient where they are and take them in the direction to help them feel better.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually just interviewed a member 2 weeks ago who had suffered a really bad heart attack. And
Mm,
one of the after effects of the heart attack was that he now gets really bad panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And he told me that there has not been a time that he wasn't having a panic attack where he took this particular model private and he didn't come out of it. And so that
wow.
tells me that makes sense to me now based off of what you said with the resonance and the nervous
Yeah.
system deregulate or the nervous system regulation and de-escalation, where if someone's like this and then they have someone who's focused on them, the eye contact, talking to them, like you said, the tone of voice and the resonance, I can see why that might bring someone down.
And I forgot to say with the eye contact, so it's the windows to the soul, right? That's where empathy lives. And if
Wow.
this member is feeling seen and that the model has empathy for him, and that's not sympathy, so different, like can just understand where he is in that moment of panic, that's going to help him so much. It's beautiful. Thank you too for sharing that story.
Yeah, yeah, that one touched me too quite a bit. Absolutely. I want to talk to you about the relationship from your perspective between connection, like we were just talking about, really, like eye contact, and our sexuality.
Oh, there's so much there. So I feel like the thread there is intimacy. So a lot of sex therapists will describe intimacy as into me see. So we're really showing someone a part of ourselves and we're wanting to see who our partner is, like that vulnerability, again, cultivating empathy. There's a lack of judgment presence. A lot of people can do fancy sexual moves and have a performative sexual experience, but a pleasurable, connected sexual experience is a whole nother level. And for most people that I talk to, that's what they're looking for. They don't want to just have swinging from the chandeliers. They want to feel seen and connected and understood and accepted.
I mean, at the end of the day, those are primal needs of a human being, right?
Yeah. And if
Yeah.
sex can be a vehicle for that, all the better. And if it can be pleasurable, and if you want to hang from the chandeliers, great. But I feel like for most people, they want the connection.
I always ask because that is certainly my thought too.
Mhm.
And I know everyone has their different reasons, but I always ask truly deep down, the bottom line beneath all of the subconscious stuff, are we using connection to get sex or sex to get connection?
Mm, I think sex to get connection.
I think so too, especially because like the touching, you know what I mean? Even if sometimes that connection isn't really there between two people, but that chase for it is, I think, a lot of the driving force for what's happening is really wanting that connection. We need that.
Yeah. And sometimes it's validation, sometimes it's pleasure, sometimes it is just being in the presence of another person. And whether that's in person or online, again, we're back to that. All sex is good sex as long as it's consensual or pleasurable. Let's not pathologize how people are getting their needs met.
Through the patients that you see, are there any recurrent themes that are blocks to a sexually healthy life? Something that you notice happens often?
Yes. Yes. Shame. One word, shame. Yeah. So it's either I can't do something I think everyone else can do, or I do something that no one else does. Right? That's the core negative belief system. There's some way that I am not right sexually. So we know guilt is I made a mistake. Shame is I am a mistake. Right? So that's the difference. Shame, a very internalized experience of themselves, an internalized experience of how they move through the world. Guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong. So guilt externalized, shame internalized.
Again, just thank you. That's just very clear for people, to make that distinction. Is guilt external? And I feel like guilt is almost, well, people can struggle with it, absolutely, but it's easier to be like, I made a mistake. Whereas I am a mistake or there is something wrong with me, that's with you all the time, that belief.
Right. And I think so. Certainly, my job as a therapist is I'm deconstructing sexual shame or relational shame. And I think for the models too, at Live Jasmin or even Harmony, the AI sex doll, it's externalizing that process. So it's taking that away of like, you are not broken. So for a survivor of sexual trauma, the distinction I make is there's nothing wrong with you. Something happened to you. That's very different. Right. And for a lot of our adult virgins or people who have trouble with intimacy, they're going to have some experience in their childhood or formative years that have created a block to a really sexually empowered life. That's what we're looking at. There's nothing wrong with a person. We've got to figure out the construct of what happened.
If you're developing your sexuality between 9-15, and then you're realizing that the people around you, the adults around you, are never talking about sex, or they make you cover your eyes, if there's something sexual that happens in a movie or whatever the case is, does that start sending the message, like already putting some of that shame in there? Like sexuality is not good, but I'm sexual.
Yeah. And it just gets so confusing. So yes, like that can be a piece of sexual shame. And then you layer on that perhaps a religion that is not, that is very sex negative or just, prioritizes waiting until until you're married to have sex, or a cultural piece of that, an educational piece of that. So the layers are just layer upon layer upon layer. Or someone has experienced childhood sexual abuse or a date rape in their teens, sexual harassment, or maybe there was domestic violence in the home that was also had a sexual component to it. There's just, it really, it takes a pretty deep dive into someone's past. And I love this work, like figuring out where the fantasy comes from. And of course, it's wonderful. It can be adaptive and we can work it into that person's sex life. Sometimes the fantasy is maladapted, meaning it just brings so much shame that we have to figure out a way to put that down.
For anyone listening who is just like, yeah, that's me. I have shame around my sexuality. I don't even know myself sexually, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is the first little step in starting to remove some of that shame?
First, our sex positive solution, right? All sex is good sex as long as it's consensual or pleasurable. Check those two boxes for yourself. Is what you're doing consensual? Does it bring you pleasure? If both of those are yes, and you're still feeling shame about that, I would want to know where that comes from. So you're going to look at your sexual template is what I call it. So what turns you on? So we've got desire, the psychological process of wanting, arousal, the physiological process of wanting. Do those two integrate for you, or are they very separate? If they're very separate, that can cause shame. So an easier way to say that, if our mind and body aren't on the same page about what we want sexually, that can cause a lot of internal conflict.
Fascinating.
So, and this work should be done with a therapist or a sexuality coach. You can do it on your own as well. I'm sorry, a shameless plug here. If you're a survivor, my book, Reclaiming Pleasure, will walk you through your sexual template and fantasies and help you kind of parse that out. But a lot of therapists do that work. So it's really valuable work.
I love the title of your book, which is
Oh, thank you.
Reclaiming Pleasure, because
Mhm.
it implies that you deserve it. Like that's yours, you know? I love that. Reclaiming your pleasure. You should have pleasure.
Yes. And in our society, like we were talking about before, sex is framed as a bonus where I really feel it's a birthright.
What if someone is completely cut off from themselves sexually? They don't have the space. Obviously, you know, a large amount of the user base of Live Jasmin is men.
Mhm.
And my theory on why so many men enjoy Live Jasmin, part of it, I mean, there's the obvious, but what's not so obvious is that I think a lot of men don't have as many spaces to just go and talk about sex freely, where there's no judgment, no issue. I mean, a lot of us in general don't have many spaces, but I feel like as women, we're more willing to see a sex therapist or more willing to go to a girlfriend about a weird experience or something like that. And so I'm curious, for those who haven't found a space or an outlet where they can just even talk about sex or their fantasies, and they're really cut off from that, are there repercussions for that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Not talking about it, not being willing to explore it, or sitting in the sexual shame of feeling, again, broken, or a word I hear a lot is dirty or wrong. Why do I like this? Or why don't I like this? That can just build up. So the consequences, this is a big conversation, but how I think about them. So there's emotional consequences, there's physical consequences, there's relational consequences, and there's sexual consequences. Right? So emotional anxiety, depression, physical, chronic pain, eating disorders, insomnia, relational inability to withstand a relationship, a lot of volatility in relationships, anger in relationships, sexual. So it could be sexual pain disorders, sexual dysfunction, tocophobia, fear of childbirth. I mean, the list just kind of goes on and on. So yes, there are some invisible wounds to not addressing your sexuality in a way that feels authentic and right for you.
You heard it here first. You have permission to address your sexuality in a way that feels authentic and real to you, as long as it is consensual and pleasurable.
Beautifully said. Thank you.
Those are your words. Yeah, I'm
Oh,
just using your words. Yeah. Really beautiful. Is there anything about your work, sexual wellness, human sexuality, or connection at large that we haven't touched on, but you want to share?
gosh, that's a great question and a big one. I I think it's just, yeah, this idea of letting yourself off the hook, because so many of us just walk around on a hook about what we should be doing, how things should go, where we should be in relation to our own sexuality. And I think if we dial that back and figure out what the hook was, where that sexual shame was really born, understanding that will affect behavior change. So how I talk about it is, first there's awareness, and then there's the understanding, and then there's the behavior change. So if you're not where you want to be, I'm just encouraging you to look back at where it started and try to connect the dots from there, because I promise it's not something that's wrong with you. There's a reason for whatever it is that you're experiencing.
Beautiful, beautiful. My final question to you is, from your experience and your perspective, what are our next steps collectively in order to build a more sexually healthy society?
I think more of us need to tell our stories, because there's empathy in that ability to share stories, to share vulnerabilities, and be able to say me too. And yes, I do mean like the cultural me too, but I also just mean holy shit, that happened to me too, or I felt that way too. You feel broken that way, I feel broken that way. Just sharing our collective stories, talking more openly about sex, that is the way forward here. The more we talk about sex, the better sex we have. It's what I do every single day. It works.
Yeah, and it kind of brings us back to just this basic primal need for humans to belong. And when we are able to have a shared experience, it really brings us back together. And that in and of itself is so deeply healing.
It is. It is. So I think the more podcasts there are, the more docuseries like this, the more books. Yeah, when people can see themselves in other people's stories, it's one of the most powerful experiences ever.
Truly. I mean, truly, there's nothing more healing. And we know this through archetypes and story. Like, as human beings, that is the thing we are so good at, is telling stories and, healing through stories, which Jung, he did a lot of that with the archetypes and all
Yeah.
of that. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And I know both of us were like, light bulb, light bulb. Thank you for helping me to think about this in different ways as well. I'm just so grateful for this platform and the work that you and the models do, and your members, for your members too.
thank you so, so much. I really, really appreciate that. This was an incredible interview, and we look forward to hopefully working more with you.
Sounds great. Thanks again.